My name is Tanya Battelle. I'm an active lobbyist for voluntary assisted dying legislation, nationally and internationally. I'm the founder of the social media Facebook page Voluntary Assisted Life Ending. I'm based in Brisbane, Queensland. I also happen to have battled breast cancer for 20 years and was diagnosed as terminal with months to live in 2016. I don't know why I'm still here. I'm buying time through being permanently on chemotherapy with some ups and downs along the way. Queensland, the only state to never have previously had an independent voluntary assisted dying inquiry, finally launched the End of Life Choices Inquiry in November 2018, with its terms of reference being released in February 2019. Throughout 2019, the Health Committee, charged with conducting the inquiry, held many public forums allowing a diverse range of individuals to have their say. These included members of the public, those who were terminally ill, health organisations and faith-based right-to-life religious institutions. The Queensland End of Life Choices Inquiry received over 5,000 submissions, the largest number of submissions presented to any state inquiry, following on from the success of the Victorian legislation and very recently the success of the WA legislation. The Queensland Health Committee is due to release its findings/recommendations on the 31st of March this year. We're pushing for the Queensland Premier to commit to the introduction of voluntary assisted dying legislation in this political term before the Queensland state election. One of the key opposing arguments throughout the inquiry when it comes to voluntary assisted dying legislation has been that rather than introducing what we know as bad, we need to inject further funds into palliative care. Some health professionals take the view, if this happens, then there's no need for voluntary assisted dying legislation. For those families who will forever remain traumatised by their loved one's death, me included, this could not be further from the truth. As an active lobbyist, nationally and internationally, what I've learned from discussions with many family members left traumatised by their loved one's bad deaths is that palliative care did not alleviate the horrific suffering of their loved ones. It didn't scratch the surface in some cases. Andrew Denton's documentary, The Broken Hearted, released in August last year, featured the stories of Western Australians who shared their horror of how their loved ones died in graphic and heart-wrenching detail. What I also observe through comments to posts on my Vale Facebook page, articles that I post, are the comments from some nurses, those who work with end-of-life patients, those working in palliative care, in aged care and other health services, and those who have chosen to actually leave the palliative care sector. The comments are often negative about palliative care being the panacea it's deemed to be for a range of reasons. When I actually followed up with these individuals, my eyes were truly opened. Several nurses would cry down the phone as they recounted their own experiences. They felt they couldn't speak up about their real-life frontline experiences of how end-of-life patients suffer for fear of reprisals in the workplace. Some were bound by confidentiality agreements. Some had spoken up in their workplace and their input had been dismissed. Some were so distressed they chose to leave the palliative care sector and return to general nursing. I found what they had to say alarming and distressing. To protect them and their workplace, I documented some of the experiences and their stories, and I referred to them as Nurse 1 and Nurse 2. The document was tabled by me as part of my own submission at the Brisbane public hearing in August of last year. The stories, as far as I could see, were not actually seeing the light of day, rather in favour of senior health professionals pushing for more funding for palliative care, rather than even considering voluntary assisted dying as an adjunct to palliative care. Some of the stories they shared had me in tears too. One particular follow-up by me resulted in discussions with someone who was not afraid to share the real-life stories. A courageous, brave, very experienced and now retired palliative care nurse specialist with postgraduate qualifications in palliative care. Whilst passionate about the delivery of exceptional palliative care, she is also an advocate for voluntary assisted dying, for those for whom palliative care cannot alleviate the suffering that comes with a terminal illness. Today, I welcome Beverly Young, and I thank her very much for her time. Thanks, Bev, for your time today and for joining me.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing my passion and advocacy for the most important needs of all, those at the end of life.
Bev, you're now retired and living in Queensland. Can we start by you sharing with us how you entered into a nursing career and subsequently palliative care?
My mother spent 2 years in hospital when I was 9, and I spent a lot of time around hospital and nurses. Always found them really kind and caring. So from a very early age, I dreamt of being a nurse. Around the same time, I lost a beloved uncle to cancer at age 36. Even at 9, I remember being absolutely traumatised when I saw him just before he died. And then later in 1980, I lost my dad to cancer, and he died in agony unnecessarily. In 1986, at age 40, I sat the entrance exam as a mature age student at Northern Rivers College of Advanced Education, which is now Southern Cross University. This was the second year intake of nursing through higher education and university. I achieved really good marks in my 3 years of full-time study and was fortunate enough to gain a position in the graduate program at Lismore Base Hospital, a large general hospital in northern New South Wales. After my graduate year, they offered me a full-time position. It was wonderful grounding, rotating through medical, surgical, orthopaedics and children's ward, and I was often placed in charge of the ward. I worked for 2 years, gaining a great deal of experience, and during that time I also undertook external studies, gaining my bachelor's degree in health science at Armidale University. During my time at Lismore Base, I encountered quite a few patients who were diagnosed terminally ill. I could see that the system did not help them their dilemma. It awoke in me a desire to work in palliative care. When my marriage ended in 1992, I headed to Sydney and requested an interview at Calvary Hospital, a renowned hospice in Sydney, which it remains today. I commenced full-time work at Calvary Hospital in Sydney in 1992. I had my registration and bachelor's degree and further extended my knowledge base to attain a position of clinical nurse specialist in palliative care. Despite this, I knew there was so much more I still needed to understand to deliver the best palliative care possible. So I undertook postgraduate studies at the University of Technology in Sydney in advanced palliative care.
Bev, you also co-authored a paper on palliative care, didn't you, back in 2000?
Yes, I did, Tanya. By the beginning of 2000, there was a very real crisis in nursing. Shortages were becoming apparent and the university entrance numbers were dropping. My very learned colleague, who went on to become a professor in palliative care and nursing, proposed that with fewer nurses available, there was a renewed imperative to demonstrate quality outcomes and best practice. The suggestion was by incorporating models of care as guidelines, those things could be demonstrated. My conflict with this proposal was, where were we going to get the nurses in the first place? Because everything becomes rhetorical unless you have enough dedicated, well-trained, motivated and accountable nurses at the bedside. This was in the year 2000. And here we are 20 years later, and I don't see that a lot has changed.
So Bev, before I ask you to explain in detail what happens with palliative care realistically and from a frontline perspective, I wanted to actually ask you for your views on what I'm about to say. So in my lobbying activities, I've written a great deal about what I call the in-between stage, and that's what happens leading up to a diagnosis, what happens afterwards, and what happens way before end-of-life stage. So for me, this information it's overlooked in the argy-bargy political debate about whether or not legislation should be introduced. So personally, I'm a member of a closed and private terminal metastatic breast cancer group of women from all over the world. The posts, the photos uploaded, the heartfelt sharing of suffering and pain, loss of quality of life, horrific side effects from treatment, and when the treatment stops working. And all of this just doesn't seem to be heard in the argument in the public forum. It's lost, for want of a better word, it's lost amongst politicians and governments, religious institutions who all believe they know best without them actually walking in the shoes of the patient. And it doesn't take into account what that person is actually going through.
There are countless life-limiting illnesses, but the one that probably generates the most fear is, of course, cancer. Surprisingly, some 30% of people with cancer never experience any pain, even some with quite serious conditions or cancer types. It's when you follow the disease process from its inception that the true horror of its effects become apparent. Take someone newly diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. There is no cure. They might not be told that at the time. Stage 4 breast cancer means that the cancer has moved outside of the breast itself to other major organs within the body. However, at the time of the pathology results, which tell what stage in the cancer is, it may not be detectable at that stage anywhere else in the body. One of the common initial forms of treatment will be radiation therapy, which burns all the deep tissue in your chest wall in the hope it will shrink the cancer to allow removal of as much malignant tissue as possible to maybe give you a little longer. The next most likely treatment after that would be a mastectomy, the debilitating disfigurement to save a life, even though at this point this isn't possible. Then there is chemotherapy to follow. That leaves you vomiting uncontrollably, wondering how long before your hair starts to fall out, and all the other terrible side effects. Even the simple pleasure of enjoying a nice meal is stolen from you, and all you can taste is metal. Before too long, you start to have pain under your arm and shoulder blades, but the morphine, even when increased, isn't really helping. It seems the cancer has invaded the brachial plexus, that's a large bed of nerve tissue in your upper chest, but you keep on fighting. Life is precious. You wake up in a sweat and you're aching, your arms laden with fluid almost too heavy to lift. Lymphedema is engorging your arms since removal of your lymph nodes in trying to slow down the relentless march of this evil disease. One day your leg starts to drag on the floor like your foot is asleep. The bad news is it's actually spinal metastases, and so now the cancer starts to invade all the ends of your long bones initially. Your spine aches, then your ribs ache, and then your hips. Inside your body, the cancer cells, which can pass easily through any other cells, have invaded the periosteum, that's the outer surface of your bones. Cancer cells replicate rapidly and are much larger than normal cells, so now the invading cells are causing your bones cells to shatter and disintegrate, increasing your blood calcium, which sets off another whole set of new problems added to the bone pain. This is a true picture of what it's like, and we haven't even got to where the pain is no longer controlled and many other possible dreadful side effects that might occur concurrently. This is just a simple picture and long before the end stage. On reflection, I must add I fully respect anyone who holds a different view, such as a doctor who cites his or her medical ethics, those people who say it's against their faith, or a matter of conscience, such as the Right to Life groups. But I ask each and every one of them and you to close your eyes and paint a picture of someone you love. Your sister, your cousin, your mother, travelling this journey, and truly search your heart and ask of their suffering, when is it too much to bear?
Bev, thank you for explaining the reality of end of life for many. In terms of palliative care now, can you share with us what palliative care really is, what it's designed to do, what it can do, what it can't do, the real version, not the executive version, but the real version from the front line, rather than the spiel from Palliative Care Australia, executive from hospitals, the senior clergy from religious-based health facilities. Can you actually tell us what it is?
Palliative care is an incredibly physical and emotionally demanding profession to undertake, and the responsibility of caring for people in the final stages of their life is taken very seriously. Palliative care is so much more than a job. It's not just the patient in your care, it's the patient's family as well. They require a great deal of support as part of the total unit of care. They too become part of the palliative care support team. Every nursing action is aimed at helping the patient achieve a peaceful and dignified death, wherever possible, whenever that might be, and hopefully leave their families with some positive memories of what has to be the most terrible time in their life. Palliative care in the ideal medical environment is designed to help control the symptoms and side effects that come with a terminal illness, to keep the patient as comfortable and pain-free as possible throughout their illness.
And yet there are thousands and thousands of families left traumatised by how they've lost their loved ones. And it's evident by thousands of submissions prepared and presented to the respective Australian inquiries that have taken place in Victoria, WA, and it's not just Australia either, it's actually across the world.
That is why voluntary assisted dying has its own place and really should be an adjunct to palliative care. Palliative care actually starts not at the end of life, but rather after a diagnosis, and its purpose is to provide that level of support to the patient throughout that journey.
You've said that palliative care starts after a terminal diagnosis. I'm actually connected with many terminally ill people, and some have said that they had to make their own inquiries about palliative care to actually understand what their options are and what care and support's there. I know it was never spoken about with me, and when I was first diagnosed, I actually initiated the conversation myself because I didn't know how quickly I was going to go downhill. And then I had to follow it up with the services available. So it's actually not an automatic step after a diagnosis, in my particular case anyway.
What is very important to note is that there are different environments for the delivery of palliative care, and they do differ in terms of their delivery of palliative care. There is hospice, which is a dedicated environment to delivering palliative care. It is usually well resourced in terms of staff, and the terminal patient is receiving targeted medical support, which we know as palliative care. Palliative care is delivered in general hospitals, including the oncology ward. Palliative care can also be delivered in the aged care environment.
I know in New Zealand, lobbying friends have said that the hospice environment is actually very, very good. And in the UK, there have been historically really great hospice services like Marie Curie, though government cost cutting has resulted in some of those services being cut. But you don't hear much about dedicated hospice services in Queensland.
Primarily, I work in a hospice environment, but I also had a number of years' experience working in general hospitals, including oncology wards, and later had 7 years' experience in working in aged care. In my experience, the only effective palliative care I witnessed was that delivered in a dedicated hospice environment. The main reason being, the doctors and nurses there have been specifically trained to meet the complex needs of a diverse number of life-limiting illnesses. The challenge and impact of the delivery of palliative care comes when it is delivered in a general hospital environment or an aged care facility and is classed as palliative care. The standard of palliative care differs tremendously from that specifically palliative care delivered in a dedicated hospice environment. Many people believe that once you seek palliative care, it's the end of the road, so to speak. By that I mean that death is literally imminent. This is actually incorrect. Some terminally ill patients reluctantly approach hospice care, where dedicated hospice care centres are available, in the belief that once they're admitted, that's it, and they will not be going home. That's quite to the contrary. Effective palliative care has always been aimed at helping the patient achieve the best quality of life possible by providing effective pain and symptom control throughout their illness. Every patient is different. Initially, most patients are admitted for a few days to get their symptoms under control and are then discharged home. Regardless, what needs to be absolutely acknowledged is that even with the best palliative care possible, it cannot address many of the horrendous side effects which come from some life-limiting diseases.
So we're constantly hearing about staff ratios in aged care. We have the Royal Commission that's looking into all of the dramas in aged care, including shortages of nursing staff. But what are the staff ratios like when it comes to palliative care? So given that you're nursing end-of-life patients, are additional resources allocated for those who are in their last stage?
Staffing numbers are pretty much constant within care facilities. They are decided on by hospital executive administration. Even in the face of any number of patients deteriorating, extra staff are not allocated. It's also not just about numbers. It's about the level of expertise, training and experience of the staff required to adapt and apply the care effectively.
Well, that level of expertise, training and experience of staff is sadly lacking, according to many of the experiences actually shared with me and other lobbyists.
A few short years ago, in a 3-phase hospital aged care facility that also had a mental health unit, on an evening shift, I was the only registered nurse on site for 158 people. If you added in the independent living unit emergency call alert, it was in excess of 300. I want to repeat something I said before. Palliative care is an incredibly physical and emotionally demanding profession to undertake, and the responsibility of caring for people in the final stages of their life is taken very seriously, and that palliative care is so much more than a job. It's not just the patient in your care, it's the patient's family as well. They require a great deal of support as part of the total unit of care. Every nursing action is aimed at helping the patient achieve a peaceful, dignified death, wherever possible, whenever that might be.
So what happens to the standard of palliative care when it's delivered in a general hospital environment, an oncology ward or an aged care facility? How does it differ from palliative care in a dedicated hospice environment like the one you spoke about in Sydney, Calvary?
As I've mentioned before, hospice environments have trained palliative care medical professionals who understand the requirements of the terminally ill, the complexity of individual cases which all require tailored medical interventions. Each person's case is unique to that individual. Especially important are effective interventions for pain relief. In general hospitals and aged care facilities, unfortunately, pain seems to sit under one umbrella and there is no tailored approach. They don't differentiate between somatic pain, which is tissue pain, neuropathic pain, which is nerve pain, and musculoskeletal pain, which is bone pain. All three need quite different modalities. You can give morphine to a patient with neuropathic pain and it will have minimal beneficial effect. What it does do is render the patient groggy, reduces their cognition, and they are deemed to have had too high a dose. So therefore, their medication is reduced and their pain remains.
What I find alarming, Bev, is that, and I've heard this many times from other nurses who have shared their experiences with me, that, at times they've brought it to the attention of those in charge who are making the decisions about terminally ill patients and their medication and procedures, that the pain relief is not sufficient. And patients are subject to invasive procedures when they go into palliative care, when they actually shouldn't be. And some of the stories from the nurses are really distressing and really shocking.
Many doctors will continue to initiate invasive procedures or unnecessary tests way past any benefit being gained from such measures, even in large general hospitals. I just want to clarify here that even in large hospitals, the doctors responsible for managing end-of-life patients are not specifically trained in the delivery of palliative care.
That's also a comment I've heard several times. End-of-life patients with days to live, subject to x-rays, intravenous antibiotics and other invasive procedures, when it's clear to palliative care nurse specialists that the individual is literally about to die, and in several cases has died within hours or a couple of days of actually being admitted to palliative care or a palliative care bed.
In aged care, the situation is even worse. Patients are often chronically under-medicated for pain relief. And it must not be forgotten that even when good palliative care is delivered, there are some terminally ill patients who simply cannot gain any relief from their symptoms or their pain at the end of life, and it really is traumatic for all those involved in their care.
So Bev, we've just gone through and you've explained in detail the reality of end of life for many terminally ill patients. What did you try to do as a palliative care nurse, which you've said yourself is more than just a job? It's all encompassing. What did you try to do, if anything, to rectify situations when you knew from your experience and your qualifications in palliative care that the treatment of a terminally ill patient was certainly not what it should be?
On many occasions, I've argued the need for and even begged the doctor in charge for PRN medication orders, which allows them to be given pain relief as required. On one such occasion, a resident with end-stage renal cancer, who I might add was diabetic and had a gangrenous right foot, was experiencing increasing pain intensity. In spite of this, the doctor kept refusing to review her dose, voicing his concern an increase could prevent and present other problems, unspecified.
So I presume by that comment that doctors are fearful of ending life because of the administration of what they see as maybe too much medication, and yet they aren't the ones actually experiencing the horrific symptoms and pain. And you've said yourself that pain sits under one umbrella, whereas it actually doesn't.
The patient no longer able to swallow her medication easily, an oral narcotic, the doctor then prescribed subcut morphine to be delivered through a syringe driver, which gives a metered dose over a 24-hour period. The only problem was his calculation had effectively reduced the patient's overall dose. Thinking there'd been an error, I drew this to the attention of the doctor, who disagreed. I was honestly gobsmacked. As a supervisor in palliative care previously, I had a great deal of experience in measuring and administering narcotic pain relief. I had no alternative but to challenge his decision. I assured I meant no disrespect, but the dosage was wrong, and suggested what I believed to be an effective dose, including an increase. I then begged the doctor to make contact with the Redcliffe Hospital Palliative Care Unit and speak to the doctor in charge. He was more amused than angry. What would a nurse know? Despite my telling him I'd been a level 3 supervisor in palliative care. To my shock, the next day he actually acknowledged he had talked to the medical director of the palliative care unit to discuss the case. And as reported back to me, he confirmed everything you said. Now, incredulously, while he did correct the dose to reflect the previous equivalent, he wasn't prepared to give what the doctor suggested. End of subject.
So whilst all of this is going on and the poor end-of-life patient is suffering, and stories recounted to me often talk about patients crying out, asking for help, I think for me, what is alarming is that all that you have just said mirrors what many other nurses who you don't even know have also shared with me. And what's incredibly sad is that all this is happening behind the scenes. Okay, so when we talk about needing more funding to improve palliative care, it's actually more than funding, isn't it? It's so much more. It's actually training doctors to understand what end of life looks like. It's adopting policies within different health facilities that deal with pain relief properly. It's the administering of appropriate pain relief to suit the patient, not to suit the doctor who might be frightened of being sued. And then there's the issue of patients whose pain and suffering, even with the best palliative care, that can't be alleviated because of the ghastly nature of their illness, in spite of medication.
That's absolutely right, Tanya.
Bev, we've heard from you how palliative care can differ, and the delivery and the standard can differ depending on the care setting, and also alarmingly that there is a lack of awareness by some medical professionals to whom the palliative care nurses report as to how to actually manage an end-of-life patient. And as I've said, what you have shared with me mirrors many other nurses. You've also told us that even with the best of palliative care, and this is my point, that some end-of-life patients' suffering and pain just cannot be alleviated. And I wanted to deviate here a little bit. Palliative Care Australia, in 2006, their position statement actually had a bullet point in it, which acknowledged that not all pain and suffering could be alleviated. And then that bullet point was removed after 2006. And I do have that document, which I can show you. Bev, you've also made it very clear that whilst you support the delivery, first and foremost, of exceptional palliative care, you also support the need for voluntary assisted dying legislation. Can you tell us why you support the legislation?
End-of-life care should be all about comfort, compassion and dignity. I have contact with many nurses working in palliative care who quietly support voluntary assisted dying. I say quietly because they are not at liberty to voice their support, except privately, mostly due to possible repercussions from their workplace. It may be said by management it's a breach of confidentiality, but most facilities have a strict guideline under the guise of code of conduct forbidding nurses to speak out. I am the greatest advocate for the best palliative care possible, but it has to be acknowledged that palliative care cannot alleviate some of the most horrendous side effects of several life-limiting illnesses. And contrary to some statements I've seen, these are not rare occurrences.
And during our many discussions over quite a few months, you've shared with me some pretty awful and horrific experiences, not only for you as a palliative care nurse, but for the individual and their families before the individual died. Would you be prepared to share some of those experiences?
There are so many, far too many to share here. It needs to be remembered that some cancers present even more horrific side effects and symptoms than others. For example, any cancer that causes a bowel obstruction is truly awful. You reach the point where surgery is no longer an option and management of the side effects fails. Even though the patient may not be taking any food now, only simply water, the body produces approximately about 200 grams of waste material through cellular replacement, etc. every day, which under normal circumstances would pass through the gastrointestinal tract. Now that is impeded, and so the patient will start fecal vomiting, that is vomiting feces from the bowel. Nothing can alleviate this. Putting in place a nasogastric tube to keep the stomach aspirated and empty fails, unfortunately due to the solid matter amongst the liquid. The tube blocks very quickly, and so it is not a measure to be employed. All one can do is regularly provide mouthwashes after each episode. I have seen this go on for several days before they finally succumb to their illness. Can you tell me where there is any dignity in dying like this?
So as you know, I have terminal metastatic breast cancer with metastases now in the lung and the abdomen. I've been advised that regarding the abdomen mets, I need to watch for pain in my abdomen. I need to be vigilant, as this could actually signal a bowel obstruction, and this fills me with absolute dread because I am informed and I do know what's going to come. It's certainly not how I want to spend my last weeks and months, I can assure you. And so how do the families cope with all of this when this is happening to their loved ones? I know how I felt when I was nursing both my parents through their horrific end-of-life stages. I felt so traumatised behind closed doors, not in front of them. Absolutely devastated, an emotional mess, just watching them wither away in pain. There were nights I went to bed and I prayed to God that they didn't wake up in the morning. It's not how I wanted to remember them, and yet here I am 20 years on since my father died and 9 years since my mother died, and like many other people, I'm still finding it hard to remember them as they actually were before they were sick, because that's what's left in my mind and the minds of many others.
While the patient suffers, so does the family, sitting by, often gagging every time their loved one vomits liquid feces, distraught at what they are seeing happen to someone they love, and frustrated at their inability to do anything to stop this awful situation. Their anger boils over sometimes when they insist there must be something you can do, and you feel just as helpless and inadequate as they do, and the only response you have is to say, I'm sorry. Like every palliative care nurse I know, I've gone home after days like this, and it's sometimes like every other one, sat down and had a good cry.
So Bev, can you share some of your experiences that you actually believe had a really profound impact on you, even as a trained health professional?
I was always shocked when I found myself in the situation where the doctors weren't conversant with providing effective palliative care, mostly among newer trained residents. Their response to questions on pain were enlightening. They again lumped pain under one umbrella, as previously mentioned, failing to differentiate between somatic pain, tissue pain, neuropathic pain, nerve pain, or musculoskeletal pain for bone pain, all requiring quite different treatment modalities. I've been seconded for 4 months as a CNS, that's a clinical nurse specialist, alongside a specialist from where I worked to a large western suburbs hospital. My patient contact was limited by the Director of Nursing, so I took the opportunity of copying copious amounts of information on palliative care and sneaked into the doctor's staff room, rest areas, anywhere else I thought they might access, leaving the highlighted copies everywhere as the only way I could think of to increase their knowledge base about palliative care and effective symptom control. Other situations proved more difficult. One such occasion actually put my registration at risk. I was on evening shift in an aged care facility and had a cancer patient who was very close to dying. The lady was in terrible agony and nothing had been prescribed for breakthrough pain. The family were in attendance and becoming visibly upset with her distress. I called an after-hours doctor sometime previously, requesting his attendance to prescribe something stronger to control the pain. As the condition worsened and the family became more agitated, I rang the doctor back and asked for a phone order in the meantime. I told him my extensive experience in palliative care and suggested a 5 milligram dose of subcut morphine should settle it. After a little hesitation, he agreed to the order. I filled out the necessary paperwork as we spoke, which he was meant to sign on attendance. Seeing I was the only RN on the site, I had to get an endorsed enrolled nurse to check the order with me and watch me administer the drug. Almost immediately, the doctor rang back and rescinded his phone order. I was shocked, particularly when he said he couldn't attend for at least another hour. I expressed my anger, again stressing the state of this lady who was now calling out in agony. He hung up. Another 20 minutes passed and now the patient was screaming in agony and writhing in the bed. The family were crying, begging me to help her, and I just couldn't stand any longer. Stand by and watch her do this. I had to do something. With their permission, I called the enrolled nurse to witness my administration of the drug. Within a very short time, the patient settled. The family come down seeing this and remained comforting her until she died some 30 minutes later. Another half hour passed and the doctor arrived to see the patient, and I let him have the full force of my anger. He quickly read her notes, checked the chart, and then became very quiet. He asked me to attend him while he pronounced the lady deceased, which is normally very unnecessary. I couldn't speak to him. I was so angry. We went behind the curtain and I stood there, and surprisingly he stood and leaned back against the wall. I became aware at that stage he was very distressed and close to tears, and then he apologised. He explained there was another doctor from his culture under investigation for malpractice, and he acknowledged losing his confidence prescribing morphine for fear his judgment might be questioned. He signed the death certificate and wrote out a phone order for what I had already given. I had to feel some compassion for him.
You're a kinder woman than I, Bev. Compassion for someone obviously out of his depth. Someone screaming in agony and a family left traumatised forever. I find it absolutely disgraceful. And what is awful, as I keep saying, is that other nurses say the same thing and families share similar stories. So some of the stories shared with me by other nurses sends a clear message that some of the awful, really horrific end-of-life situations, they don't seem to ignite any urgency or priority from the doctors in charge in the hospital environment. Not all, but in some cases. And it really is a case of, well, I'll get to him or I'll get to her when I can get to them. Can you comment on this?
My answer is, in my experience, especially in aged care, no, they are not treated as a priority.
My comments actually come from stories shared by nurses which were not limited to the aged care sector. So it's really important that our politicians and decision makers actually understand what is happening on the front line. So even with additional funding, which clearly needs to happen, and along with a more uniform and standard approach to palliative care across the board, particularly not just in cities but in rural areas, You obviously believe that voluntary assisted dying needs to be an option for those who wish to choose it.
The saddest failure of the current system was when a lady came to us in the hospice with advanced metastatic disease in her bones. We'll call her Helga. From a foreign country, she had no one there to support her except an ex-husband who had stepped up when he'd found out her situation was terminal. She'd been admitted in the hope that palliative care might address her increasingly severe pain. The extent and nature of her bone disease was such that any major movement caused her absolute agony and the risk of bone fractures. There were already spontaneous rib fractures evident. Having accepted her situation was terminal, her one dream was to go home to her little cottage and garden and live out the remainder of her days. Helga's ex-husband had even agreed to move back in to help her achieve this. Movement had to be kept to a minimum, both to minimise her pain and reduce the risk of further fractures. The level of care required in providing toileting, hygiene and pressure area care was major. It was obvious going home was not an option. Helga was distraught, saying her quality of life was gone and she wanted to die. No amount of support from the pastoral care or social worker trying to help her come to terms with her situation appeased her. Helga was adamant she wanted her suffering to end. A couple of weeks passed as her pain grew worse. Suddenly Helga awoke one morning, full of spirit, was seemingly quite happy. She continually thanked the nurses she'd come to love, giving some of them little mementos of personal things from her drawer as thanks. No one read the signs. Late that night, after the final morphine round and ward check, sometime after 11:30 p.m, when everyone was sleeping, without a single sound being detected, Helga managed to climb out of bed, push the bedside chair across the half 9-bed ward, out the door, onto the veranda, climbed up on the chair and jumped off the second-storey balcony. Her empty bed was discovered at the next round and her body a short time later. No one was left unaffected by this. Everyone felt as though we had failed her. In truth, it was the system that failed her. Had she lived, only God knows how much more pain she would have suffered before she died. I have absolutely no hesitation in giving my full support to voluntary assisted dying legislation as a necessary option for a person who, through the effects of their illness, feels they have no quality of life. I don't believe there is any justification for making someone suffer unnecessarily until the end. I have always tried to live well, and I would like to think that given these same circumstances, I would have the choice to die well.
Bev, I'd just really like to thank you for your time. Thank you for being so courageous in sharing your many years of experience in nursing those at the end of life.